and when he had drunk, the spirit came again, and he revived. Wherefore he called the name thereof En-hakkarath, which is in Lehi unto this day. And he judged Israel in the days of the Philistines for 20 years. This is a pretty interesting story, and if you haven't read this or heard this story before, it's kind of crazy, but it is very interesting. I mean, you look at Samson and the things that he did, catching those foxes and tying those torches in between their tails and setting them loose in the cornfields, and then beating and then killing all these guys single-handedly. It's an amazing feat, and it's amazing things that Samson did against the Philistines in this chapter of Scripture. But when looking at this, I titled the message this morning, Samson Fights Fire with Fire. Samson Fights Fire with Fire. I want us to look at all the things that Samson did in this chapter of Scripture. And I know it's been a few weeks since we went over Samson, but we remember that his wife betrayed him at one of their marriage feasts, and he gave a riddle to the men of the marriage feast, and of course they couldn't come up with the answer, so they threatened his wife and said, we'll burn you up if you don't give us the answer, or get Samson to give us the answer. And she betrayed him, and of course Samson got mad, and he went back to his parents' house, and here he is at the top of this passage of Scripture, coming back to meet his wife, and what does he bring her as a way of saying he's sorry? Brings her a present, right? Guys, that's what you need to do, right? If your wife may be mad at you or whatever, you always need to bring a present, and it makes things better sometimes. What do you think, John? Anyway, Samson brought her a present, and it was a baby goat. What would you ladies think if your husband was mad at you and came home with a baby goat? Not a very good present. Jordan, you might like that, all right? Aaron, she might too. Aaron likes goats, but I don't know where to put the thing.
John done it.
What's that?
John done it.
Oh, really? Okay. Well, usually flowers work better, boys. That's how there is to it. But anyways, so he came back into his wife, and obviously his father-in-law had betrayed him and given her unto his companion instead. So he said, I thought you hated her, so I gave her away to somebody else. You can have her younger sister instead. And this just made Samson mad. It made him angry. Put the fire in him, and he fought back fire with fire. So the first thing I want you to see about Samson Fights Fire with Fire is how he first used foxfire against the idolaters. He used foxfire against the idolaters. And this is literally foxfire, not what you find in the woods. So let's look at this verses 1 through 5 beginning with. But it came to pass within a while after, in the time of wheat harvest, that Samson visited his wife with a kid, and he said, I will go into my wife into the chamber. But her father would not suffer him to go in. And her father said, I verily thought that thou hast hated her. Therefore I gave her to thy companion. Is not her younger sister fairer than she? Take her, I pray thee, instead of her. And Samson said concerning them, Now shall I be more blameless than the Philistines, though I do them a displeasure. I want us to look at that verse first, verse 3. He used foxfire against the idolaters. Why did he use this foxfire? Why did he send these foxes into their cornfields and into their wheat fields and their olive groves and their grape vines? Because first he was angry because his father-in-law gave his wife away to somebody else. And also, as he says there in verse 3, Samson said concerning them, Now shall I be more blameless than the Philistines. Put this down for the first thing. He used foxfire against the idolaters, first for their broken bond. They broke their bond. They broke that marriage vow. He didn't break his marriage vow with his wife. His father-in-law did. They had that bond together. They had that marriage vow, and they broke that bond. So what did he do? They broke the bond of marriage, and there was nothing holding him back now, he said. I will be found blameless because they're the ones who broke up this bond, he said. It's not my fault. It's my father-in-law's fault who did this. So he said, I'll be found blameless, though I do them this displeasure. The first thing is, he used foxfire against the idolaters, first for their broken bond. The second reason why he used foxfire against the idolaters, look at verse 4 and 5 with me. It says, And Samson went and caught 300 foxes, and took firebrands, and turned tail to tail, and put a firebrand in the midst between two tails. And when he had set the brands on fire, he let them go into the standing corn of the Philistines, and burnt up both the shocks and also the standing corn with the vineyards and the olives. So he used foxfire against the idolaters, first for their broken bond. They broke the bond between Samson and the Philistines, between Samson and his wife. Not only that, but he burned down their crops because they were idolaters. It tells us in verse 1 that it was around the wheat harvest. This was a time when the Philistines, they would take the wheat harvest, they would take the corn harvest, and they would sacrifice things to their god Dagon, which we'll read about later on. but they sacrificed things to their god Dagon. So what basically he was doing was he was burning down those sacrifices that they were presented to an idol. So I want you to see this. So basically he was justified in what he was doing, and God used this for his purpose because he was burning down these false sacrifices that were going to these false idols, and instead burnt them down for the use of God. He burned their sacrifices to Dagon, and he burnt up their livelihood. Now I want you to think about this, going on to the next point, and Mark and Joey and all you guys who plant crops, how would you feel if somebody took these 300 foxes, and that's a crazy thing, catching 300 foxes and putting torches in between their tails, tying them together and setting them loose in this field. But how would you guys feel if somebody burnt down your crops? Okay. If they're insured, right, you'd be happy with me. But I want you to think about this, because now the Philistines were mad because all their crops got burned down. But the first thing, Samson fought fire with fire. He used fox fire against the idolaters. Took those 300 foxes, tied their tails together, put a torch in between those tails, and set them loose in all the fields. Kind of a crazy way to do it. But anyway, so he used that fox fire first. The second way that Samson used fire with fire, verse 6 through 8, let's read this together. It says, Then the Philistines said, Who hath done this? And they answered, Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite, because he had taken his wife and given her to his companion. And the Philistines came up and burnt her and her father with fire. And Samson said to them, Though you have done this, yet will I be avenged of you, and after that I will cease. And he smote them hip and thigh with a great slaughter, and he went down and dwelt in the top of the rock of Eden. I want us to see the second thing here. Samson first fought fire with fire. He used fox fire against the idolaters. Secondly, he used the fire of vengeance. He said, I will be avenged of you. He used the fire of vengeance against the betrayers. You can see this process going on and on. I mean, he used this fox fire against them. They retaliated by doing what? They burned his wife and his father-in-law. I want you to see how crazy this is, though, this first point here. He used the fire of vengeance against the betrayers. First, for those who reaped what they sowed. Verse 6, it says what? And the Philistines came up and burnt her and her father with fire. What did they threaten with his wife in the last chapter we looked at there? If she didn't get the riddle out of Samson, what were they going to do to her? Burn her and her house with fire. Burn it to the ground. Burn her. Kill her that way. And basically, what does she do to get out of being burned? She betrayed her husband. She betrayed the man of God. So what basically happened here? Instead of going to her husband and saying, look, these guys are threatening me with fire. Can you help me out, Samson? Which he would have gladly done. Obviously, he can handle himself. Instead, she went to the pagan people and said, look, I'm going to do you guys a favor, and I'm going to get this out of it. So I put this down for this thing. For those who reaped what they sowed, she reaped what she sowed because she betrayed Samson. Not only the time before, but here now, her father-in-law and herself, they betrayed Samson, and she went to another man. You reap what you sow is what this shows you. Don't play with fire or you'll get burned. What goes around comes around is what you need to think about here. This woman and her others, a very terrible thing what happened to them. But she should have turned to Samson before instead of betraying him. And even in this sense, she should have turned to her husband instead of to another man. So they reaped what they sowed and what they did here. But I want you to see Samson's reaction to this. Because even though his wife was that bad and left him for another man, even though this happened to Samson, he still was mad about them killing his wife, even as bad as she was. And so what did he do? He fought this with this fire of vengeance. This is awesome to me when you look at verse 7 through 8. It says, And Samson said to them, Though you have done this, yet will I be avenged of you, and after that I will cease. So let's look at that verse a second. What did he say here? They basically killed his wife and father-in-law because, one,